Viewers, as part of our year-end programming, welcome to The World Tomorrow. This series will look at what to expect as we move further into this new decade. Viewers, tonight we are going to speak about whether India can become a military superpower. By when? The timeframes, the possibilities. Let's open this up without delay because it's important to hear from our very erudite panel. General VP Malik, former Chief of the Army, is with us. Air Chief Marshal Fali Homi Major, former Chief of the Air Staff, is with us. Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff, is with us. Dr. Sanjay Baru, Distinguished Fellow, United Services Institution of India. Maruf Raza, Group Consulting Editor, The Times Network. All these eminences require no real introductions, viewers, and I want to first begin with General VP Malik. General Malik, the world respects power. Increasingly, we are seeing that the world, and this is in specific context of China, respects assertion. Global assertion. I don't know what else to call it, provocation or naked aggression or hegemonistic or a hegemonistic impulse. But the fact is that while we have all tried to invest in soft power, hard power still matters. And India is in a very delicate environment. Obviously, we are building up our defense capabilities, but we have a way to go. The aspiration is to match China, perhaps even overtake China in defense capacities. Is it possible? And if so, what is the time frame?
What is power? Power really is our capacity to influence the other nations in this case. And our capacity to influence other nations would be part of our national power. And I'm not using the word assertion, which we have used for China. India doesn't assert, but India needs to influence others in its own national interests. So that is the important part. You're right that our soft power has been good, has been doing a lot of good work. But when it comes to hard power, which you yourself said is not only the defense part, but there are other elements of national power, which we still have. In some parts, we are okay with that. For example, geography, natural resources, we are fine with it. But then there are other aspects of national power, like the strategic culture of our country, internal homogeneity and internal security part, economic development, or science and technology, or our defense industry, and leadership, even political leadership, I would mention that. Now, in these aspects, we are way behind China yet. And we have to make up these things to be able to create a balance of power in our region where we are able to influence our neighborhood.
Dr. Baru, let me come to you. You've argued in favor of spending 3% of GDP on defense as a rule of thumb. However, over the past decade, as India's GDP shot up, the ratio has gone down, actually, from 2.7% in 2010 to 2.1% in 2020, so over a decade. How do you view this? Are we doing the right thing? Maybe we need to change our own expectations of power. Maybe it's not military power. Maybe we need to invest somewhere else.
That estimate of 3% of GDP was made by the National Security Advisory Board in 1999-2000. That's 21 years ago. The Indian GDP has become much bigger, and therefore, as a percentage of GDP, one could say a little lower percentage is not such a big issue. Secondly, I think it's more important to also look at defense expenditure as a percentage of central government expenditure, because essentially central government's responsibility. But Rahul, the fundamental point I'd like to make is to quote Kautilya in his Arthashastra, who said that it is from the strength of the treasury that the army flows. This is an exact quote from Arthashastra. In other words, it is how strong your economy is. Treasury is a metaphor not just for the fisc, not just for the financial and fiscal resources, but the overall strength of the economy. So unless you have a strong economy, you cannot allocate more and more for defense, because for a poor country like us, and we are still a poor country, developmental priorities are still number one. And I agree with General Malik when he says that there are many ways in which one defines hard power. Military power is only one of them. In fact, the Chinese developed the concept of comprehensive national power, which gives a lot of emphasis to economic capacity, scientific and technological capacity, human capital. All these are elements of hard power. So unless you get the entire package right, merely talking about military expenditure or military budgets, I don't think really captures the nature of Indian power.
So let me go straight across to Admiral Prakash. Admiral Prakash, the question is, and it's a narrow one, we have a massive challenger in our geostrategic space of influence, our sphere of influence, and that is China. Parity is one thing, getting beyond is quite another. Dr. Baru has mentioned, General Malik Saab mentioned that we need to focus perhaps in a more well-rounded strategy. Where do you come in on this? Do you believe that we should be actually investing in our economy and that will take care really of the other ancillaries? Or should we be actually looking straight at upping our game with defense procurement and so on and so forth? I'll quote something else that once Dr. Baru said. He said, if we cannot spend more on defense, we would need an economic and a foreign policy that would step in to bridge the gap. Where do you stand on this?
Well, as it stands, we are the third largest spender on defense in the world. In absolute terms, we are the largest importer of military hardware in the world, or second largest. So you can buy all the things you want, but that doesn't make you a military power. And we've got a 1 million+ strong army. So on those parameters are really hollow, because within a week or 10 days of the start of any conflict, we will be looking over our shoulders for help. So as the earlier speakers have pointed out, your strength, comprehensive national strength, is essentially based on your economy, on your technological prowess, diplomatic ability, and then also backed up by military. So I think we should stop focusing just superficial on something as superficial as military strength or military hardware. We need a strategy, we need a vision, we need economic strength, we need technological prowess, and then we should start, dreaming about becoming a military superpower. Because I think talking about it today is just a great leap of faith. That India hopes to become a military superpower is I think, a very superficial dream.
So are you suggesting, Admiral Prakash, that the question needs to be rephrased, that there is no possibility of that happening unless, of course, the operational preparedness of the armed forces improved, we have greater self-reliance in manufacturing weapon systems, etc. Now, obviously, these are things that are a work in progress. But we saw China emerge from nowhere, 30 or 40 years of economic liberalization, and they're at this point. We've also been liberalizing. Some would say not fast enough. Some would say with more caveats than the Chinese system allows. But nonetheless, the trajectory is one of reform. So I'm asking, is it just too much to expect of ourselves?
So let's go back to 1947 when we became independent. By then, China had already fought a long civil war. They were participants in World War II. They were part of the Allied, structure. And then their leadership had a vision in 1949. Our vision was different. Their vision was different. Mao Zedong had a vision that China will one day be a world power. It will be a nuclear power. It will be numero uno in Asia. Whereas we thought that Chinese are going to be our friends and fellow travelers. They had a vision for themselves. And the vision that Chinese leadership and the Chinese Communist Party has shown over the last 70 years is quite different from our vision. And if you're looking at them, I mean, you have a trajectory, but the trajectory has a start point and an end point. So look at the Chinese trajectory, which started when they kicked out the Russians in the 60s. They started reverse engineering every piece of Russian military hardware, from the Kalashnikov rifle to a nuclear submarine. They made a hash of it to start with, but in the second, third iteration, they got it right. Today, they are almost on par with the USA, and they'll soon overtake them. Have we shown any vision for this kind of thing? We've had strategies for various other things, power and energy and so on. There has not been a vision for military power. There's not been a vision for military industry, arms, etc. So we are where we are because of lack of vision. Even today, forgive my saying so, but I think we are surviving more on slogans than on a vision or a strategy or a monitoring system, etc. Slogans are all fine for electioneering and raising morale of the people. They are not a substitute for a strategy and a vision, which is totally lacking.
Air Marshal Major, let me come to you. We've been preparing a rollout for integrated theatre commands. There's a talk about unification of the force arms. This is something that China has undertaken, of course. We're on that trajectory now. Will that also lead now to better, perhaps, defense preparedness in the face of a provocation?
Military power in today's environment and today's world, to me, is to begin with, in a classical war, if at all it ever happens, there are going to be no victors and the vanquished. Given the intensity, given the nature of warfare which exists and obtains today, I think our economic power, our military power, and our diplomacy are equally important in all respects. We need to concentrate, in my reckoning, more on our inherent capability to address conflict and other situations, because classical wars are going to be far and few in between. And if we were to, of course, not that we shouldn't be ready for such an eventuality, but our immediate concentration should be on to address the very changing of, nature of warfare in the foreseeable future. For example, I think what is going to cause more damage to countries are, things like cyber attacks, covert operations, whether it involves the economy, whether it involves the military, or whatever else. And therefore, our military today needs to be lean, mean, effective, with technology being infused on practically a daily basis. And that is what will take us forward. Whether we have theater commands, we don't have theater commands, and the nature of our fighting let's leave it to the present day military commanders and the political leadership to decide. Because, if we were to think and address these issues at this stage with all of us who are sitting here who have been detached from the armed forces for a while, we would only be, crystal gazing as to how things should be done. Whereas the people in actual command today have the real information and real-time knowledge of what is happening and how they're going to go progress and bring about the necessary fighting capability.
That's a good point, Air Chief Marshal. A good point. Maruf Raza, how do you reduce the India-China power deficit? Direct question.
Well, Rahul, that's an important question, and I think to some extent some of the distinguished speakers have answered that, particularly Dr. Sanjay Baru, as well as earlier speakers like General Malik and Admiral Arun Prakash. You see, the point to understand is, and you asked this at the beginning, and I remember this being quoted in some of the discussions I was part of in the late 90s and early 2000, that India, as per a parliamentary standing committee appraisal, could look at spending up to 3% of its GDP on its armed forces. But the problem was then, and the problem exists now, that whatever amount you devote as a percentage of your GDP it largely goes not in enhancing your core military capability by enhancing your internal defense industrial complex, but as Admiral Arun Prakash brought out, we have the dubious distinction of being the world's largest or second largest arms importer. Also, we need to understand that percentage of GDP really doesn't count very much if your GDP is galloping, as in the case of China, or even increasing, as in the case of India. So, it could be 2.9%, it could be 1.7%. The US GDP spend on weapon systems is percentage-wise lower than perhaps China's, but the US spends something close to $778 billion, whereas we spend $72 to $78 billion. But it still ranks us as number 3. There are countries much smaller than India, but they punch in almost the same global strategic appraisal of what the country's weight is. Look at Israel. It's a country of 8 million people. It was founded at the same time as us, 1948, we are 47. But it punches well above its weight because they have defined for themselves what should be their core strategic interest. I am sorry to say, Rahul, our successive branches of political and civilian leadership and even military commanders have never come to a consensus on what are our core strategic interests and how do we go about achieving it. The other aspect is there is a complete disconnect between the civilian elite and the military elite on how to go about achieving that. Future conflicts and your future enemies and the way you will engage with them will not just need hard military power per se. I have always argued that we have enough military power to defend our interest, our territorial interest, and that stands vis-a-vis China even today. But what we are not exploiting is a national demographic dividend. We have some of the brightest people in the country, but we are not using them. We have made all sorts of restrictions on who can enter the national security space or not. Look at the defense industrial complex. It's a web of nepotism. We are not allowing private companies to come in because it will threaten the interests of the defense public sector undertakings. Otherwise, you think given the opportunities, the Tatas, the Mahindras, the Reliance and whoever else can't produce what HAL or somebody else produces. But there's all an extended family of the MOD in South Block, and therefore they have to be protected. You have to open the space up. Defense and national security and national pride will be shared by everybody if everybody is allowed to participate in the process. You can't have walls and barriers. So I think, the subject has to be understood in its entirety, and I personally have gone beyond counting guns and missiles.
Right.
They only serve a limited purpose.
Well, it's very important. I want to bring in Dr. Baru once again because you've spoken about, Maruf, you've spoken about this demographic dividend. Now, one feature of countries that are able to project power, Dr. Baru, is that they are very cohesive internally, societally. In this discussion that we've had, no one has really talked about political consensus. That, at this moment, there seems to be a deficit of. How will that impact our ability to thwart external challenges?
Frankly, things have actually become worse. We have become less inclusive as a nation. And therefore, I think what I worry increasingly about is internal cohesion as a weak spot in terms of our external power and strength. India was seen as a great democracy because it was a developing country democracy, the only country in the developing world that was multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic, plural, secular democracy. And when George Bush met Dr. Manmohan Singh and the nuclear deal was signed, this is what he said. He was asked the question, why is the United States willing to do a nuclear deal with India and not with Pakistan or not with North Korea, not with Iran? And the answer was very simple. because India is a plural, multicultural, multi-ethnic, great democracy. And that's a part of our strength. It's part of our comprehensive national power. And unless we defend these constitutional values and democratic values and ensure that we have a politics of inclusion rather than exclusion, I don't think military power is going to take us very far.
Okay, it's interesting because even as we speak, viewers, we've had spiritual leaders like the Dalai Lama speaking with the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwat, and he has said that India is a very inclusive country. Of course, this debate is an important one, viewers, because if you don't have agency, societal agency at home, you're not going to be able to fight as one any challenge that comes your way. And I think, Dr. Baru, we might, talk about the degrees of the retardation of social cohesion in this country. But there is no doubt a cleavage right now which needs to be bridged, and it needs to be bridged pretty quickly. I think I would agree with you. We need to move very quickly to restructure our politics in a manner that allows for greater inclusion, and then perhaps from there on come out with what Maruf Raza has said, a focus on where we really want to wield our power, and then look at what General Malik and Admiral Prakash and Air Chief Marshal Falihomi Major have said about adding really the bells and whistles, fine-tuning where we need to put our money, so to speak, after we make some of it. I'll leave it at this, viewers. It's been an interesting debate. I'll leave it at this. Look forward to another dialogue and another subject as part of the series, The World Tomorrow.